Hello everyone, welcome to the video. My name is Maze, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how to make this Japanese inspired toolbox for about $20. So some of you might be thinking, why make a toolbox for about $20 when I could just buy a plastic one for about $10? Well, for starters, because this one looks cool. It's got character, okay? You can't buy character. Number two, it's just fun to make things, and it's always better to use things that you make than things that you buy. And lastly, because you can customize it to your needs. If you open up a lot of people's plastic toolboxes, you'll find it's overpacked with a bunch of stuff that doesn't really go together, or it has things that go together but there's just a lot of empty and wasted space in the box. This way you can customize the size of your toolbox to fit specific tools or specific sets of tools, and maybe, just maybe, have a more semi-organized workshop. Alright, now let's talk about the materials you're going to need. All of these materials are available at a home center type of store, in my case Lowe's. The main parts of the box are made from soft woods, with the dowels being the only hardwood. And although soft woods are light and reasonably durable, which makes for a good toolbox, the main reason I made this choice was for cost. I want to be able to replace all of my toolboxes with these homemade ones one day. So even though I may make a hardwood one for some special tools, I was more interested in finding a workhorse toolbox that I could make a bunch of them for all my tools. The first thing you need is one of these 3/4 inch pine panels. This is for the top and bottom of the toolbox, but you can see for $7.18 you get a 16 inch by 3 foot panel, which if you need more than that for the top and bottom, you are making a tool chest, not a toolbox. Just saying. I had part of one of these left over from a previous project, so that's what I'll be using to make mine. If you have the tools to mill your own lumber, you can just buy 2x4s and mill them and glue them up. You save a few bucks, but you're not saving that much money for the amount of time it takes. Then you need these redwood fence pickets. Now I chose the redwood ones because I like the way that they look, but they also had cedar and whitewood ones for about the same price, give or take a buck. So either of them I think will work just as well. Now these are rough. If you like a rougher look, then go for it, but I would spend some time finding some of the cleaner and smoother ones in the bunch. Also, I'm making my box for my hand plane, so it's probably smaller than the one you might want. So I was able to use just one of these, but my $20 claim does allow you to buy 2 of these if needed. After that, you'll need some wooden dowels. Now the dowels you use should not be bigger than half the thickness of your wood. So I used 1/4 inch dowels. I needed 2 of these. And I used 3/8 inch dowels, and I only needed 1 of those. And lastly, you will need some screws, and any screws will do. I didn't include them in my costs because you'll only need them temporarily, and you should have some lying around. But if you don't have any lying around, you can get some for a couple bucks if you need to. And again, we're only using them temporarily, so you don't need that many. You can reuse them and do some of the glue ups in several stages if you have to. And as far as tools go, you can do this whole project with just a handsaw, a drill, and an orbital sander is highly recommended, if not technically necessary. And if you're just getting into woodworking and thinking about buying tools, you can make a lot of really nice things with just a handsaw, a drill, and an orbital sander. Now I'm going to be using a lot more tools than just that because I have them, but just know all you really need is a saw and a drill to make this. Alright, enough of that. Let's just make some dust, right? So I'm taking my leftover piece I had and I'm just ripping it in half, trying to get as much width for both pieces as I can out of this board. Then I'm going to take this board and I'm going to measure the length and width of this board and add those two measurements together. Then I take that measurement and cut two pieces out of my redwood picket to that size. Now, your measurements will be different than mine, so it doesn't really matter what that measurement is, as long as it's the same as one length and one width of your bottom piece, and you need to cut two pieces to that size. This next step is optional. I took both those pieces and the piece I had left over from that picket over to the planer and planed them down. The boards come at a very rough 5/8 inch thickness, so I planed them down to a 1/2 inch thickness, which gave me a nice smooth surface on both sides while still being thick enough to do the job. Now you don't have to use a planer, you could just sand these smooth or use a hand plane if you want, or not really do anything at all, although they are pretty rough, so I do recommend at least sanding them. So that's everything roughed out, and now we need to fine tune everything. So to do that, we take the longest tool you're going to put in the toolbox, in my case a hand plane, and add 4 times the thickness of the redwood to that. 2 thicknesses in front of the tool and 2 thicknesses behind the tool. And instead of measuring it, I prefer to use the actual tool and redwood for this. And then I add a little on top of that, maybe about 1/8 of an inch. Then I took that length and set my stop block and cut the bottom, both sides, and the top to that length. So you can kind of see here how the sides and the bottom are going to go. Now I take the offcuts from cutting out the 2 sides, and those are going to be what I use for the ends, but I need to cut the thickness of the bottom off of them, so I use an offcut from the bottom to set up that cut, and then I cut both end pieces. And finally I take that 3rd piece I had left over from the original picket and rip it into 2-inch strips. So now that's all the rip cuts done. And let me just say, I wanted to get some footage of me doing some of the rip cuts by hand, but it's real hard to motivate yourself to do rip cuts by hand when you got a table saw just sitting there and it's so easy. So I lazied out on that and just used the table saw. But for the cross cuts, I'll go over to the bench and just do the rest of the cuts by hand so that you could see that you can just use a hand saw. So I need to make these ends as long as the bottom is wide. So I just use the bottom and make my line. There's no need to take any measurements, just use the piece that you want to match and use that to mark your pieces with. And then just cut it. Then we need to cut the pieces for the side handles. So I take one of the 2-inch strips that we cut earlier, and I cut off 2 pieces that are also as long as the bottom is wide. Then, using my leftover 2-inch pieces, I cut out 4 pieces that are as long as the width of the bottom plus the thickness of both sides. Now I'm actually making a mistake here, and this is because of my unfamiliarity with redwood. What I should have done is make 2 of them as long as the width of the bottom and thickness of both sides, and make 2 of them at about 1 inch to 1.5 inches, whatever I could manage with my stock, longer than that. And I'll show you why later, but 2 of these pieces I'm cutting I should have left as long as I could. Okay, so that's all the cutting done. Now it's time for assembly, but before we do that, let's break down the cut list piece by piece just to be very clear about what exactly you need. The first thing you need is a top and bottom, long enough to fit your longest tool, plus 4 thicknesses of your side material, plus at least 1/8 of an inch, or as long as you want it to be really, but at the minimum, big enough to fit your tool, plus 4 thicknesses of your side material, and at least 1/8 of an inch. Then you will need 2 side pieces that have the same length as your top and bottom. And you will need 2 end pieces that are as long as your bottom is wide, and as wide as your sides are, minus the thickness of your bottom. Then you will need 2 handle pieces that are about 2 inches wide and as long as your end pieces, or as long as your bottom is wide. Then you will need the 4 pieces that go across the top, which we will call the top braces. All of them are about 2 inches wide, and 2 of them should be as long as the width of your bottom plus the thickness of both sides, and the other 2 should be 1 inch to 1.5 inches longer than that. I of course made the mistake of cutting all of these to the same size, and I'll show you a little bit later why that was a mistake. So now it's time to assemble it. So you want to start by attaching the sides to the bottom. And you want to spend a good amount of time laying out exactly where you want the screws to go. It's important because A, you don't want to miss the board you're trying to attach to. You want to aim for the middle of that board. And B, because we will be replacing all of these screws with dowels in a later step, and they will stand out. And you want your screws to be symmetrical so that your dowels look good. And once you are happy with your screw placement, you can go ahead and drill your pilot holes and then screw your boards together. And once you are satisfied with that, you can unscrew the boards just enough to unattach them, lay down a bead of glue, and then screw it back in. Then we need to attach the end pieces. Now the end pieces are inset from the edge by the thickness of the handles. So use a handle as a spacer and then lay out the screw placement for the end pieces. Make sure that you're square and pay close attention to the bottom because you'll be drilling through the bottom essentially blind. Now I put in 3 screws to start, then glued it up, and then finished off the rest of the screws. Next, we need to work on the side handles. Now I took mine over to the scroll saw to cut out a kind of handhold. You could use a jigsaw or a bandsaw or a coping saw or a fret saw if you don't have a scroll saw. But honestly, it's more for looks than function. If you just left it straight, then it works just as good, really. So if you don't have any of those, you could just skip this. And so then after the scroll saw, I took it over to the belt sander to clean it up a little bit. Then attaching the side handles is pretty straightforward. You lay out your screw holes again, and then you apply glue and clamp it in place, and then drill your pilot holes and screw in your screws. Then you want to put on your top braces. These are the pieces that I should have made about 1 inch or 1.5 inches longer and then centered it on here. But it's the same process as the rest of it. Lay out your screw holes, drill your pilot holes, apply glue, and then screw it in. The last part we need to work on is the lid. So right now the lid is too long, so in order to cut it to the proper length, place it in the box, put it all the way to one side, and then see where it's hitting the other side, make your mark, lay out your cut line, and cut it off. Then we need to lay out the placement of the braces for the lid. For this, we want to work from the center lines and not from the edges. So find the center of both the length and the width of the lid, and also the center of the length of the braces. Then measure an equal distance from the center line of the lid's length. In my case, I chose 2 inches. Place your braces on the line and line up the center of the brace to the center of the lid's width, and drill your pilot holes, add some glue, and screw it in. And then you are essentially done. If you want to stop here and leave the screws in, you can, and be finished. You don't even really have to sand it or put oil on it if you don't want to. It should work just fine, and being soft wood should last long enough. While I do recommend at least putting some boiled linseed oil on it. So from here on, everything I'm going to show you is optional, just to give you some few ideas of things you can do and things I like to do to my projects. So the first optional part is the top handle. I kind of did this on a whim. I had this small piece left over from the picket, so I cut off the knots and then cut it in half and glued it together. Then I freehand designed what I thought was a Japanese type of handle, but honestly I would like to apologize to any Japanese people watching, or anyone watching with Japanese heritage, or anyone who has visited or has ever wanted to visit Japan in their lives, or even if you've just seen one anime. I'd like to apologize because what I came up with looks more like a dock cleat than anything Japanese, but it works as a handle. And I honestly wouldn't recommend this edition because one of the great things about a Japanese toolbox is that you could stack them on top of each other. They're basically a cube, so it's real good to have a bunch of them, and it's real organized just to stack them on top of each other. And with the handle, you can't really stack them. But it is like a nice decorative feature if that's what you want. And it is strong enough to lift up the toolbox when I got it full of tools. You have to be careful though, because if you swing the toolbox too much, like if you try to walk with it, the lid would probably come off. So it's not super practical, but it helps you take off the lid. And if you wanted to grab it and lift it up and then grab the side handles, it works for that. But when I make a bunch of these for my workshop, I'm not going to be adding the handle. It's if you like the way it looks and you want to add the handle for a decorative feature, this is how you do it. But I'm not going to do it in the future. So another option you have is feet. Now as you can see here, when I cut the sides off, I had these offcuts left over. So I decided why not use them as feet. So I tried them out. Now one thing I learned that is if you're going to use feet, use long grain. I had these short grain offcuts, so I used them, but it ended up being very splitty. It would split real easily. I had to be real careful, and that's kind of a characteristic of redwood I learned. So other words might work better, but just use long grain instead. Another thing you want to do that I learned is space out your feet so that they would fit between the top braces of another box if you set it on top of that box. That way you have the benefit of feet, so if you set it on the ground, there would be some airflow and your bottom of your box won't get wet, but you won't be sacrificing any stability if you set it on top of another box. So feet are a feature I'm thinking I'm going to keep moving forward, just keeping in mind those things I learned and modifying them slightly to work a little bit better, but I can see how they could be beneficial, so I recommend making some feet. The last option is one I highly recommend. It's kind of my go-to move when I have something I can't easily clamp or when I don't need or have time for fancy joinery, and that is to replace all the screws with dowels. I believe that metal and wood connections are very weak, and that if it's going to be a failure, that's where it will fail. So in general, and in my opinion, screws are not a great way to connect two pieces of wood unless you plan on taking them apart again, or you simply don't have the time to do anything else and it just needs to get done fast. If you want something permanent and simple, replacing the screws with dowels after the glue has dried is a great technique and just looks way better and more professional than screws. So it is as easy as you would expect it to be. You simply cut up your dowels, take out the screws, drill a hole big enough for your dowels, glue them in, and cut them flush. So in general, you don't want to use dowels bigger than half the thickness of your wood. So anywhere I was drilling into 1/2 inch redwood, I used 1/4 inch dowels, and anywhere I drilled into 3/4 inch pine, I used 3/8 inch dowels. Okay, so earlier I said that these two braces should be cut longer, so let me show you why. When I drilled the pilot holes and put in the screws, everything was fine, but when I went to drill the holes for the dowels, because it was so close to the edge, the wood just split out. Now I don't think that it will structurally matter too much because there's still a lot of glue surface that's holding it on there, but it just doesn't look very good. So the first thing I was doing wrong was using an impact driver instead of a regular drill. But the impact driver is the only cordless drill I have, so normally I just use it and it works fine, but it is a little bit rougher on the wood than a regular drill. So I got out my old corded drill, and instead of using a regular drill bit, I used a brad point bit instead, and this all helped a little bit. It made it less of a problem, but it didn't solve the problem. So the best thing I could have done was avoid the problem altogether by making the braces a little bit longer, and then the wood would have more support and wouldn't chip out and split as much, if at all. And then afterwards I could have come back, and after the dowels had dried and everything, I could come back and trim off the excess, and it would have looked just a lot better and cleaner. So all that's left is to sand it and finish it. So it doesn't have to be super smooth, so I just went to 120 grit and called it good. But I did make sure to flush up all the dowels and make sure those were smooth, and to get rid of any pencil or saw marks. And then I just gave it a few coats of linseed oil. Now this is my favorite part, so I'm just going to let this run through a little bit. And there it is, Japanese inspired toolbox that can be made for about $20 and with limited tools. And I really like the look of this. It has a nice rustic look to it, and that redwood will darken over time and just bring out the character of that wood just that much more. So I hope that was helpful and inspires you to get in your workshops and make some dust. If you end up making one of these, I would love to see it. Post it on Instagram and tag me. You can find a link to my Instagram profile in the description, and leave me a comment telling me what you think. And if you enjoyed this or learned anything, if you would hit that like button, I would be grateful. YouTube is telling me that my like score is low, so help me out in that department. That would be awesome. Subscribe if you're new, and thank you to all of you who have already subscribed. I had a goal of reaching 100 subscribers in 2018, and thanks to all of you, and especially to Jay Bates and Matt Cremona, who have kindly featured my work throughout the year, I made my goal. So thank you very much, and now let's double it. And that's the video. Thank you very much for watching. If you haven't already, hit that like button, subscribe for more content like this, ring that bell for notifications, and maybe watch another one of my videos. You can follow me on Instagram if you want to see more of my work or some sneak peeks, and stay tuned for my website, which I'm currently building. So thank you very much for your time, and don't forget to support your local craftsmen or get out in your workshops and make your own dust. And together, we can make making great again.